The sea was black with ships. From horizon to horizon, steel hulls rolled through gray swells, engines drumming beneath decks packed with men and machines. The smell of salt, oil, and fear filled the air. In the pre-dawn mist off Normandy, hundreds of small wooden boats waited for the order that would open the gates to Europe. Their ramps faced the enemy coast, and behind each ramp stood soldiers who would carry the war to Hitler's fortress. As the signal flares lit the horizon, the fleet came alive. Landing craft dropped into the waves like metal coffins, engines coughing as they pushed toward shore. The men called them Higgins Boats, small, flat-bottomed craft with squared noses and a steel ramp that could lower in seconds. Each one carried a platoon of infantry or a jeep, packed so tight you could taste the sweat of the man beside you. They were crude, loud, and terrifyingly exposed. Yet they were the tip of the spear, the one machine that made the impossible invasion possible. Before the first Higgins boat hit the sand, the idea of landing entire divisions on a defended beach had been nearly unthinkable. In the interwar years, most generals, especially German and Japanese officers, believed amphibious invasions were too complex, too vulnerable, and too slow to succeed. You could seize a small island, perhaps, but not a continent. The Germans had no equivalent craft, and their own planners dismissed Allied talk of mobile harbors and armored ferries as fantasy. When intelligence first reported mass production of wooden landing craft in American shipyards, German officers laughed. They thought the Allies were wasting resources on toys. But deep in the bayous of Louisiana, one man, Andrew Jackson Higgins, had already proven them wrong. A brash, stubborn boat builder with no naval pedigree, Higgins had designed a shallow draft workboat for loggers and oilmen to move cargo through swamps and sandbars. It was a civilian craft, practical, ugly, and tough. When the U.S. Marines saw it, they recognized its potential. Higgins redesigned it for war, adding a ramp, strengthening the hull, and making it light enough to drop from transport ships. He called it the LCVP, Landing Craft, Vehicle, Personnel. The genius of the Higgins boat was simplicity. It could run aground on a beach, unload troops and vehicles in seconds, and then reverse back into the surf for another run. Its flat bottom let it skim over reefs and sandbars that would trap heavier vessels. Its steel ramp let soldiers charge straight forward, weapons ready. It could carry 36 men or a jeep and crew, just enough to bring a complete fighting unit ashore in one load. And it could be built anywhere, from New Orleans to the Midwest, by factories that had never seen the sea. By 1944, the U.S. was producing over 20,000 of them. Each one was a boxy miracle of industrial speed. Entire divisions could now move from ship to beach in waves, organized, supplied, and deadly. At Normandy, at Tarawa, at Sicily, they became the bridge between sea and land. And when the first waves of soldiers dropped their ramps and sprinted into the gunfire, the Germans stopped laughing. They watched from their bunkers as thousands of Higgins boats poured men, jeeps, and tanks onto beaches once thought unassailable. It was no longer theory. It was invasion on a scale the world had never seen. The small, simple boat had become the weapon that unlocked Europe. The Higgins boat was no longer a curiosity. It was the hinge of history. Andrew Jackson Higgins was not a military man. He was a shipbuilder from New Orleans, with a temper as sharp as the saws in his factory. Before the war, he built shallow draft workboats for oil crews and trappers working the swamps of the Gulf Coast. He knew the way mud, sand, and current could stop an ordinary hull cold. When he heard Marines complaining they couldn't find a boat that could land on a beach and pull back out, He already had the answer sitting in his yard. The first prototype looked nothing like a war machine. It was small, wooden, and box-shaped, but it could drive straight into a sandbar, unload its cargo, and back away without grounding. Higgins called it the Eureka boat. When the Marines tested it in 1938, it outperformed everything the Navy had. The only thing missing was a way for troops or vehicles to run straight out of the bow. A Navy officer suggested a ramp like the Japanese had used in China. Higgins didn't argue. He designed one in days. That bow ramp turned a clever workboat into a weapon. Soldiers could storm ashore without climbing over gunnels. Jeeps could drive straight onto sand. It turned landing from a slow, vulnerable process into a single violent motion. Ramp down, charge forward, fight. The Navy hesitated, still skeptical of civilian builders, but the Marines pressed for it. As war loomed, Washington ordered Higgins Industries to start full production. Higgins went to work like a man possessed. He transformed his small Louisiana yard into a network of massive assembly lines running 24 hours a day. Carpenters, welders, and housewives joined in. They built boats faster than the Navy could inspect them. Higgins standardized every part so his boats could be made by the hundreds in scattered plants and shipped by rail to any port. Each unit took just a few days to complete. When America entered the war, the production flood began. By 1943, more than 12,000 LCVPs were already in service. The boats moved troops at Guadalcanal, ferried tanks at North Africa, and carried rangers up the cliffs at Sicily. Every Allied invasion, from the smallest island raid to the full-scale European landings, depended on Higgins's design. Eisenhower himself later said, "Andrew Higgins is the man who won the war for us." If Higgins had not designed and built those LCVPs, we never could have landed over an open beach. German and Japanese planners had no equivalent craft. Their landing boats were few, slow, and poorly protected. They relied on capturing harbors, a luxury the Allies could now ignore. The Higgins boat erased that constraint. Wherever there was coastline, there was a possible invasion. It forced the Axis to defend everywhere and stretched them thin. By 1944, Higgins's plants employed over 20,000 workers and had delivered more than 20,000 boats. Wooden hulls stacked along the Mississippi ready to ship out, each one painted dull gray, each one destined for some distant beach. The boat builder from New Orleans had changed the geometry of war. The first true test of the Higgins boat came in 1942, when American and British forces launched Operation Torch, the Allied invasion of North Africa. For the first time, the U.S. military attempted to land tens of thousands of men directly onto enemy-held beaches without a port. The sea was rough, the wind brutal, and the coastline mined. Yet the small plywood boats from Higgins Industries plowed through the surf, carrying infantry, tanks, and jeeps toward the Moroccan and Algerian sands. They slammed ashore, dropped their ramps, and poured troops into battle. The invasion succeeded, and it was clear the concept worked. The Higgins boat could land an army. What followed was a chain of amphibious assaults that would define the war. At Sicily in 1943, Allied forces landed more than 150,000 troops across nearly 100 miles of coastline. The Higgins boats led the way through rough surf, choppy waves, and machine gun fire. They grounded themselves on rocky beaches, dropped their ramps, and unleashed wave after wave of soldiers. For many of the men, it was their first time under fire. When the ramps dropped, bullets hissed across the surf, tearing into water and wood. Dozens of boats were riddled with holes before they could unload. Yet, they kept coming. Within hours, entire divisions were ashore. The boats that survived returned for more. In the Pacific, the same story repeated in deadlier form. The landings at Tarawa in late 1943 were chaos. Coral reefs stopped larger craft hundreds of yards offshore, leaving Marines wading chest-deep under fire. But the Higgins boat's shallow draft allowed them to pass over reefs and deliver troops close to the beach. Even so, many were hit, burned, or sunk. Boat crews kept steering toward shore, even as shrapnel punched through their wooden hulls. Some coxswains made a dozen trips before being killed. Their bravery made the difference between total disaster and a hard-fought foothold. Then came D-Day, June 6, 1944, the largest amphibious invasion in history. More than 4,000 Higgins boats took part. The English Channel churned with waves of them, bouncing through the gray water toward Normandy's beaches. Inside each craft, 36 men crouched shoulder to shoulder, their faces pale, their rifles clutched tight. When the ramps dropped, they stepped straight into hell. German machine guns opened up from the cliffs, cutting men down before they could take 3 steps. Entire boatloads were wiped out in seconds, but others kept landing. One wave after another. Thousands of Higgins boats delivered 156,000 Allied troops onto the beaches of Normandy that day. The Germans, who had once mocked the Americans' toy boats, watched their strongpoints collapse under the relentless tide of landings. From their bunkers, they saw the sea itself turning into an army. Vehicles, artillery, tanks, and entire battalions came ashore in perfect rhythm. The Higgins boat made the invasion unstoppable. By the time the day was over, the wooden landing craft had proven their worth beyond question. They were scarred, burned, and full of bullet holes, but they had done what no navy had ever done before: delivered an entire army through the surf, under fire, against a fortified continent. When the last beaches of Europe were secured and the tides of war began to recede, the Higgins boat had left its mark on every coastline touched by the Allies. It had been to North Africa, Sicily, Normandy, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, and Okinawa. Wherever men had to go ashore under fire, it had carried them. It wasn't beautiful, it wasn't armored, and it wasn't fast, but it worked. It was the bridge between the industrial power of America and the blood and grit of the infantry who fought on the sand. By 1945, over 23,000 Higgins boats had been built. They carried not just soldiers, but the entire logistics of liberation: jeeps, ammunition, field hospitals, and food for millions. For every tank rolling through France, a Higgins boat had once carried its first crate of fuel. For every Marine charging across a Pacific island, that boat had been his first step onto enemy soil. The world's largest amphibious fleet had been built from plywood, nails, and New Orleans determination. But when the war ended, Andrew Jackson Higgins, the man behind it all, faded quietly from view. His factories shut down almost overnight. War contracts ended, workers returned home, and production lines fell silent. The Navy, which had once ignored him, offered polite thanks and moved on to newer steel designs. Higgins himself grew bitter, convinced history would forget what he and his crews had done. He died in 1952, long before the scale of his contribution was fully acknowledged. Yet, the proof of his genius remained. Military historians studying post-war amphibious doctrine realized that every major landing in history, from Incheon to the Falklands, owed something to the blueprint Higgins created. His design changed the shape of modern warfare. Even the landing craft used in today's navies still follow the same essential principle: a flat-bottomed vessel, a front ramp, and the ability to move men and machines directly from ship to shore. The irony was powerful. The boat, once mocked by German and Japanese officers, had not only helped destroy their armies, it had redefined what a modern military could do. Eisenhower's words, "Higgins is the man who won the war for us," became more than a compliment. They became a historical truth. In New Orleans, where the first prototypes had once been hammered together by hand, the National World War II Museum now stands. At its center, displayed with quiet pride, sits a fully restored Higgins boat. Visitors climb its ramp, step onto its worn wooden deck, and imagine what it felt like to face the open surf, the smoke, and the machine guns beyond. It is a memorial not of metal, but of ingenuity and courage. A reminder that even in war, victory often begins with an idea. In the decades after the war, the Higgins boat became more than just a piece of equipment. It became a symbol of what determined minds and practical innovation could achieve. For all the tanks, aircraft, and battleships the Allies built, it was the humble, flat-bottomed craft that changed the geometry of warfare. It made the impossible possible. It gave armies the ability to strike anywhere, on any shore, without the need for ports or docks. It turned the ocean into a road. The Higgins boat's design lived on in every major amphibious operation that followed. The U.S. Navy's landing craft of Korea, the British assault boats of Suez, and the amphibious vessels used in Vietnam all traced their lineage back to Higgins's invention. Even the modern landing craft air cushion, LCAC, capable of gliding over surf at 40 knots, owes its DNA to the wooden ramp boat born in New Orleans. But beyond engineering, the Higgins story is one of underestimation and defiance. A self-taught boat builder, dismissed by bureaucrats, mocked by German intelligence, ignored by naval tradition, ended up building the tool that delivered freedom to millions. He turned plywood into strategy, and a civilian idea into one of the war's decisive advantages. In the factories of New Orleans, thousands of ordinary workers, welders, carpenters, mechanics, and women who had never built a boat before became part of that mission. Every nail they hammered, every hull they painted gray, was another step toward liberation. Their effort represented the broader truth of World War II. Victory came not only from generals and soldiers, but from the collective hands of those who built, shipped, and believed. By the time the war ended, Higgins's boats had carried more than 2 million soldiers to battle. They crossed oceans, delivered freedom, and returned carrying the wounded and the dead. Today, restored LCVPs still float in museums, veterans' parades, and historical reenactments, silent witnesses to the moment when ordinary wood and steel met extraordinary courage. The Germans once called them floating boxes. History calls them something else: the boats that won the war. If you were moved by this story, by the courage of the men who rowed those boats, and the genius of the man who built them, like, share, and subscribe to WWII Heroes Legends. Here, true stories of innovation, sacrifice, and valor come alive. Because the heroes of World War II deserve to be remembered, one story at a time.